Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics, brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the writer of my comic of the year, Slaughterhouse-Five, as well as other titles like The Unbeatable Squirrel Girl and Power Pack. It's Ryan North. Thanks for coming on, Ryan.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for having it be your book of the year, too. That's great.
Yeah. I do think it's kind of funny saying that, this is my book of the year and its writer is Ryan North when I'm talking about Slaughterhouse-Five and I'm not saying Kurt Vonnegut. So I guess I really should say Kurt Vonnegut, you and Albert Monteys were the people who adapted Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five. I don't want to I want to give you credit, but I don't want to give you too much credit, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not here to take credit for Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five. It's right that his name is the top one on the book. He helped out a little.
Just a little bit.
He's I did some Choose Your Own Path Shakespeare books where I did the covers there myself, so I gave myself top billing above Shakespeare. And, he helped out. It's a project me and my buddy Bill did together a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. But now I'm working with Kurt.
There we go. You're just working with all of your faves. Well, and I do think that is a really nice thing about this, because when I was originally writing down questions for myself, or things I want to talk about, I was like, oh, was Ryan a fan of Slaughterhouse-Five before? And when I was researching this, I actually discovered that Kurt Vonnegut is legitimately one of your favorites, which it's interesting. I think that helps. Because I imagine not only do you have external pressure to do this job right, but you have internal pressure because you just love this stuff. This is something you really care about. But at the same time, I imagine that's kind of intensifies the experience a little bit.
Oh yeah. I mean, it is intense in that you don't want to be the person who screws up Vonnegut. But I think the advantage there of already being a fan of him and this book in particular is that I've spent 20 years of my life, not nonstop, but thinking about the text. And so it wasn't like I read it with the eye of how do I adapt it. When I got the assignment to adapt it, I could already sort of think of different ways that could go because I had an idea of the text already that I got while not wanting to adapt it. So it lets you sort of pay off years thinking about a book, I guess, in a weird sense.
Yeah, no, I mean, I imagine you look at it completely differently when you're doing that. One way you're just appreciating it as a reader, and the other one you're looking at it from how would I convert this into a different form. But I do think it's really interesting to think of your work now, knowing how much you love the book, because I don't mean to make this an all roads point back to Doreen Green and The Unbeatable Squirrel Girl, but it is really interesting thinking, Slaughterhouse-Five at its core is an anti-war novel. It's really, it's a foundational element of it. And,
yes.
Doreen is one of my favorite things, and I talked to you a lot about it for the piece I wrote for Sketched about Squirrel Girl, is that I love how you baked all these nonviolent solutions into that story. It was always about Doreen finding ways around the traditional supervillain solutions. And I'm not trying to make it sound like you're anti-war yourself, in the way that you write superhero stories, but it does make me wonder, whether this story in particular was a foundational story to you beyond it being a story you enjoy.
I mean, I wish you put that question to me a week ago so I could think of I gave it an answer it deserves. Besides going, yeah, maybe, I don't know. Sounds credible. The thing with Doreen is that she is conceived of as a smart character, a clever woman. And I felt like a clever woman would realize there's probably a more effective way to help people than to punch them until they stop doing crimes, which is where her whole how can I actually solve the root of this issue thing comes from. But yeah, I mean, you're right in saying that I think it's fair to say if you're adapting a book like Slaughterhouse-Five, you're probably not the biggest fan of war and think maybe it's not that great. And that's something that you could draw a line between the two. Sorry, that was a horrible answer. Really well thought out question. I wish I was better at this half of the part of the conversation.
No, it's totally fine. I mean, I remember one time I was talking to Brendan Fletcher and Carl Kerschel about Isola right after it was announced, and I asked this complicated question about environmentalism and Miyazaki and all this stuff, and I remember just sitting across from them and they were just like, how dare you? How dare you ask this question right now? I mean, sometimes that thing happens, but I mean, that makes sense. Well, let's move on.
No, that's a good question. I will answer that question with a yes.
I like it. Okay, so let's jump into Slaughterhouse-Five, the adaptation. And, I know that Archaea/Boom was already putting the deal together with the Vonnegut estate before you got on board. Like, you were step 2 in a path to this book coming together. But I am interested, as a fan, as somebody who loves this book, what was your gut reaction when you first heard Slaughterhouse-Five was being adapted into a graphic novel? Like, even beyond it being a potential project for yourself, like, did you have some level of, like, I don't want to say revulsion, that might be overstating it, but like a reaction to it beyond, yeah, this sounds amazing?
Yeah, I had a reaction of, oh shit. I was talking about it with my editor, and we were talking about Vonnegut in general and how we'd love to adapt one of his books in general. And then I said, I love him. I'd love to be involved in this. What book were you thinking of? And Sierra said Slaughterhouse-Five, and I said, oh, that's the hardest one. That's the best one. That's what they call the seminal one. And it felt like if I had my druthers, I would not start with Slaughterhouse-Five, because that would feel like that would be the last book people want to adapt after practicing in all the other books. So it was a sense of fear. Absolutely. You don't want to be the person who screws up Vonnegut. And this is a book that is his most well-known and is most beloved. And the stakes are so much higher, if you're doing Slaughterhouse-Five. So yeah, I had a moment of fear. It's funny, they told me later when Albert came on, they contacted him, and I recognize this is a self-serving story, but it's a cute self-serving story. They contacted Albert and said, hey, we want to do a Slaughterhouse-Five. Do you want to be involved? And he replied saying something to the effect of, this is an unadaptable book and a horrible idea. And I sent him my script, and he was like, oh, this is actually pretty good. Okay, no, actually, this is good. Now I really want to try. So it was, I think we all had that initial reaction of no, right? The same reaction I get to say, if you said they're going to remake Back to the Future, I'd be like, no, that does not sound good. And the idea of adapting it, I think it becomes something good and something valuable when you're doing something with the text that elevates what's there in the prose. It's not necessarily something new, but it's highlighting it differently. Mm-hmm. Because my worst fear of this book is I don't want it to feel like someone photocopied Slaughterhouse-Five, lost some of the pages, and drew some pictures in the margins. Like, that is a bad adaptation. And if that's the book we're talking about doing, then I don't want to do that, because that feels like anyone could do that almost.
Right.
And I wanted to do a book, not to say like I'm this perfect, God's perfect child, the only one who could do this, but the idea of like I wanted to do an adaptation that would feel like it was an adaptation that I did and that Albert did, something that we couldn't, that other people couldn't have done, if that makes sense. Like something that feels almost like our version of the text.
Yeah.
But also true to the text. Like it's no one wants to see, okay. Here's an example. The first line of Kurt's book is all this happened more or less. And the first line of our graphic novel is all this happened to Kurt more or less, because we wanted to foreground this as Kurt's story. But there is a version of this adaptation where we could have, put ourselves in the story as much as Kurt put himself in the story.
Right.
So it starts with like me and Albert reading the books when we're teenagers, stuff like that. And that felt like a bad version of it. I don't know.
No, that totally makes sense, because it's like, I mean, you could even make an argument that there is a version of that actually makes a lot of sense. That, like, you guys putting yourselves into it is almost like fitting to it, because there's always like the metatextual elements of this book, and there's that totally, I could make that argument. But at the same time, it's like, tying into what you were saying about like how you framed Kurt. Like, one of the things I thought was really interesting when I was rereading it today is I noticed how you reframed, and I'm sorry I'm bringing up like a very crude moment in the book, but reframing the moment where Kurt Vonnegut was shitting out his brains.
Yep.
It was like a very simple but like effective reframing where you take the line where it's like I was that soldier, I was the author, and I was shitting out my brains or something along those lines, and all you did was you just subtly changed it to Kurt, and you changed it to Billy witnessing him, and it's interesting how something like that is like so subtle, but it still keeps the author present, which is such a crucial part of the book. And I think I don't know. I mean, I think that like looking at it, the interesting thing about reading this book is it simultaneously highlights all the strengths of Slaughterhouse-Five while also highlighting all the strengths of the comic book form. And I think that's what's so interesting about it is like after reading it, I was just like, in some ways, it kind of feels like Slaughterhouse-Five always should have been a comic, if that makes sense.
That's very kind. I mean, I think that's we did a good job, right? Is it feels at home? Like that was the goal. Let's do a adaptation that feels at home in the medium. Where if you had somehow magically never heard of Slaughterhouse-Five, you could read this comic and you wouldn't think, oh, that was a good adaptation of what was clearly originally a prose novel. You think, oh, that was a good comic. Like I wanted to. I set the fantasy in my head that Kurt Vonnegut I'm an editor, and Kurt Vonnegut had been commissioned to write a comic, and he screwed up and sent in this giant prose novel and then went on vacation. So my job was to turn it into comics and make it feel like this is comics. This is indigenous to the medium. Like I tried to pull out all the tricks I could. I call them tricks. I should call them something fancier. All the literary techniques I could in the graphic novel medium to do things with comics that we could only do in comics whenever we could, to make it feel like this is where the story was born, even though it was born in prose, but to try to make it feel at home there. The Roland Weary equipment paper doll cutout page was an early example of that, where I thought, oh, this could work. Like, it's the same idea, because in prose, it's just a list. It's a big paragraph of all the stuff he has, and the feeling is that's a lot of stuff. Mm-hmm. We can get that same feeling across visually in this really sort of fun comics indigenous way that's early on in the book, and it made me sort of realize I think this will actually work. We can do this. There's enough here that feels at home in comics. Surprisingly, I think. I don't think Kurt ever thought of it being a comic, but it works really well.
I did think it was interesting reading interviews with Albert about it, where he referenced the fact that he was actually, in some of the parts, redrawing things that Kurt himself had drawn. And like illustrations that he had done, and also like the way that he was hand lettering it, like in specific ways that match what Kurt did. It's interesting because it's like, it's like we're talking about that line, the line drawn between these two things. I mean, you all were rooting it in what was already there, even Albert, which is something I didn't even realize he was doing.
I didn't realize it either until I was doing a presentation for a school, and I wanted to fade between. I was doing a slideshow. I wanted to fade between like script and pencils and inks and colors and final page, and then I noticed I took the art from the original book to compare, and it matched up perfectly. And I emailed Albert. I was like, "This is amazing! I didn't even know you did this." And he found out recently that because the Spanish translation just came out, and the common paperback Spanish edition of Slaughterhouse-Five removed those illustrations, which he only found out when he was doing a talk. And people were like, what are you talking about, illustrations in Slaughterhouse-Five? Which is crazy, because I feel like they're so important to the text.
Yeah. Yeah.
The handful of illustrations he does feels like they're there for a reason. He didn't just doodle in the margins, and the publisher was like, I don't know, stick it in. Like there's some art and intentionality to that. So it feels weird to remove it.
Yeah. I do wonder, you mentioned Albert and how he was like originally skeptical about the project too. I wonder, I mean, it probably didn't feel like it, but I wonder if there is some semblance of an advantage to being skeptical about this type of project up front. Like it might bring like the proper level of respect and fear to bring its very best self to life, if you will.
Yeah, maybe. This is the only really adaptation I've done, so I've only ever approached him from a place of deep respect and horrifying fear. It's hard to imagine it otherwise.
You gotta take on something easier next time.
I'll just adapt a book I don't really care about. And,
there you go.
Knock it off in an afternoon.
Well, I think it's funny that you brought up the Roland Weary paper doll page, because that was something that I was going to bring up as like, it felt very singularly comics. There were some parts in the comic that that made me feel like, I don't know, it was weird. In the beginning, there's the part It's right before the R supporting cast, and it says the two versions of our story are very similar, only ours has more pictures. For example, both begin like this. Listen, Billy Pilgrim has come unstuck in time, and both end like this, with the bird saying "Pooty wheat." And it's interesting because that moment right there, it seems like a strange moment to say this is the moment that totally sold me on this being like an adaptation that's going to work. But I was just like, I don't know. I mean, it's interesting to read this because Slaughterhouse-Five is fundamentally a story that's about being, it's about time and space in a lot of different ways. And the interesting thing about comics is the art form itself is fundamentally able to play with those two things in ways that other mediums can't do so agilely. I don't know if I just invented a word, but I just pronounced it terribly. But it's interesting because there are some things that you were doing with the text where it's like, if you were just doing a straight word for word adaptation, it would have probably been a considerably longer book. But because you can like leave it to the art, and Albert can like make things work in really efficient ways, I don't know. I mean, it's like I said, it's those little beats like that just showcase how perfect of a fit it is for that story naturally, which is fascinating.
Thank you. It's funny. One of the sort of, I guess you call it a meta joke of the book, is that comics historically in North America has been considered a juvenile and degenerate medium.
Yep.
And so we kind of have fun with that by, saying our two versions of the story are very similar, only ours has more pictures. It's such a belittling way to describe the book, which is why I put it in there. I thought that was great. And the idea of one of the few major changes we made to the text, when I did a pitch for the Vonnegut estate to be like, here's what the book's going to look like, I said, here's the changes I want to do. And the biggest one was, instead of being a failed author of science fiction pulp, Kilgore Trout has fallen so far that now he's writing comics,
right?
Like even below sci-fi Trout or sci-fi prose. And the other one was, I'm going to update the language a bit and change the way Billy's wife is portrayed to make it less mean. I felt like that part hadn't aged as well. And the reason for changing the language is just like, language changes over time. These words were not as harmful then as they are now. And I'm sure Kurt wouldn't want to harm people.
Yeah.
That's central to his ethos, is to not hurt people. So it seemed like a very easy, and there's no pushback on that at all. They're like, yeah, do it, ship it.
Yeah. I do want to say in regards to Kilgore Trout, maybe the most amazing, that might be overstating, but one of the best bits of cartooning that Albert does in the entire book is when Elliot Rosewater is talking about how Kilgore Trout is writing comics now. And Elliot has like the most disgusted look on his face. And it's just like the fact that you and Albert like combined to have this savage moment of this man being disgusted by comic books in a comic book was very beautiful.
Thank you. The whole reason of making him a comic artist is that we get to then see his work, because Vonnegut, different people. Vonnegut does this thing that works like gangbusters in prose, where he kind of just summarizes the Trout story, shows you the best parts. And you can do that in prose and it works, but in comics you couldn't. Like you'd want to see this. I felt like you'd want to see the story. You wouldn't want to hear someone describe the story. You'd want to see the actual story.
Right.
And the easy way to do that is to do it in comics form, and then making him this, golden age sci-fi sort of EC horror style cartoonist works really well. And Albert, I got those pages back. I was amazed. He did it. The coloring he did, it sort of went outside the lines on the black, so you could see. It looks so authentic. I couldn't believe it. And it just works. It works so well. You get to read these, goofy but really cool idea stories where, his work is frightful. Only his ideas are good. Like, that describes a lot of early comics, I think.
Yeah. Well, so you were touching on some of the stuff that you were, you're updating the language, changing Kilgore Trout and everything like that. I know that Archaea reached out to you for this, but when you were originally pitching what you were going to do, when you were like talking about how you would change it, how much did, I guess it might be a little bit more narrow than I'm giving it credit for, but how different was your original pitch versus what you finally finished up with once you started working with Albert and everything?
I think it's pretty much identical.
Yeah.
I basically said, "Here's the book I want to do," and they said, "Great." I mean, the final book is different than what I wrote in the script because Albert brought his own stuff and changed it and made it better. But in terms of the pitch to what I wrote, I think the initial pitch I wrote, maybe 5 or 6 pages describing what the book will be like in terms of tone and content and stuff. And then I included, I think, maybe 10 pages of example script, the first 10 pages of the book, just to show like this is what we're shooting for. And those with very little changes became the first 10 pages of the actual graphic novel. So it was pretty much, I said, I want to do this. And they said, sounds good.
So when
we did it.
When they first approached you, was it really just you sitting down, rereading, just kind of mapping it out in your head before you actually went back with your pitch?
I don't think so. I think I basically pitched at the high level what I wanted the book to be and adapted the first 10 pages. What I did do was I went out to the bookstore and bought a new copy of Slaughterhouse-Five, the biggest one I could find with the biggest margins.
Nice.
And then reread it and put tons of notes in the margins of, stuff I wanted to include, stuff I wanted to excise, ideas for how certain scenes could be adapted. Just sort of almost a cheat sheet for myself. And then the nerdiest part of it, I won't say nerdiest, the most efficient part of it was I knew he wanted, I believe it was a 170-page graphic novel. And the version I had, had 250 pages. And so that gave me a ratio. So as I was adapting the book, I could run a quick calculation to see if my percentage complete of the graphic novel matched the percentage complete of the prose book, which gave me an idea of how close I was. So I don't want to go over, I don't want to run out of space. And so I had an idea of, I've got 5 pages of wiggle room here, so I can really stretch the scene out if I need to, stuff like that. I mean, I knew that the big scenes I wanted were the 2 double-page spreads of Dresden before and after the bombing. It's the emotional heart of the book.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be a 2-page spread, but other parts, I think most of the extra pages I had, if I felt like I had some, I'd just expand out some Kilgore Trout stories if I could.
Yeah, I love that you turned that into a mathematical equation. That was a very, honestly, like if I told my wife that, and I will tell my wife that, she'll be like, that is exactly what you would have done. And I'm like, yeah, that probably is exactly what I would have done. But I mean, honestly, like that,
it's a safety net.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the thing is like, if you get to a point and you're, towards the end of your script and you realize, oh, wait, I have like a bunch more to go. And it's like, it's not like there's a lot of wiggle room in that 170 necessarily. And so you have to, I don't know. It's like, it's not like a progress bar. It's not a progress bar for like a file uploading or something like that. It's like, you have to be aware of where you're headed to make sure that you don't, harm future Ryan as he's working on this book.
Yeah, I mean, especially what you're doing in comics where, there's a difference between the left-hand page and the right-hand page. And you want a really good turn-the-page reveal on the right-hand page, which carries you with forward momentum throughout the book. So it saved me from having to go back and tweak things, which is always super hard.
Yeah. I did want to talk about some of the lines you use specifically and some of the ones you had to come up with. I mean, one of the things that's really amazing, and I didn't remember this because it honestly has been a bit since I read the novel itself. You had to write Edgar Derby's speech that Vonnegut had just summarized. You had to actually write what he said. And
that was the hardest part.
I have to imagine so. I mean, the interesting thing is, and I do want to, emphasize this, it is actually my favorite part of the book. I remember I was reading it, like, I think it was like the day before the election. And it was kind of, I hate to say, yeah, I mean, it was combined my emotions with where the world was with Edgar Derby's hope for America. And like what you came up with, I mean, honestly, it felt like those, like the inspirational speech that would make everyone feel the way it was supposed to. And I don't know. I mean, you already said it was the most difficult part, but I mean, when you were trying to channel Kurt and try to make that happen, like what was that experience like?
It honestly felt a bit like a prank that Kurt was playing on me, because I get to that point and I was like, oh no, this is a very important speech that Kurt has again summarized, which works great in prose and does not work in comics. Like I can't. There's some tricks I use with Derby earlier where he describes how he got captured, and I put a narration box on top of his word balloon, and give you sort of Kurt's summary of his story, which works well for that scene because it's not an emotional heart of the story scene. And it felt like I can do that once. I couldn't do that twice because you'd feel robbed. You'd want to hear what he's saying here. So it felt like Kurt had pranked me because I got to this point and now I had to write this thing. But it also felt, I mean, this whole book felt like almost a license to get away with something. I've talked to other writers before I even did this book where we would mention how, like, if you read Kurt Vonnegut, he's dangerous because then for the next couple of days you want to write like Kurt Vonnegut, and you can't because then you're just ripping off Kurt Vonnegut. You've got Kurt Vonnegut disease, and you're plagiarizing him effectively. But when you're adapting his book, like you're allowed, you lean into it. You get to write as much as Kurt as you can. And so that sequence was me getting to do that and trying to figure out how he would have written this scene if he actually chose to write it. And I'm glad, like, I've had, my editor mentioned that was one of her favorite parts. And then I got to tell her that I wrote it because she had forgotten it wasn't in the original book. Mm-hmm. That made me feel good. It's like, phew, it passes. Like, it passes as Kurt. That's all I wanted to do.
That is one of the interesting parts about reading the book is like kind of going back and like looking up what was like direct quotes and what wasn't, or what was you like slightly morphing things. Like, I love, another part I really love in it is the way that you all handled the poster or the piece of art with the phrase that Billy loves that's on the wall that gives him great. It's supposed to give everyone warm feelings. I mean, what is it like? You can't control the things. Oh, God, I'm not even gonna try to say it.
God grant me the Infinity prayer.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, I love the line where it says, "Among the things Billy Pilgrim could not change were the past, the present, and the future." Which
such a brutal line.
What's that?
It's such a brutal line.
It is. But it's interesting though, because it's like part of it, at certain points, it almost feels like there's like a zen to it for Billy. And it's fascinating. Mm-hmm. It's fascinating reading that. But I am interested in, that was a direct quote from the book. How do you decide when specifically to use a line and when to morph it or when to slightly adjust it?
That line in particular, like I said, it's a brutal line. I loved it because it's heartbreaking, but also funny. It's a hilariously bleak line. Yeah. He was just unable to change anything. I remember in the book I bought that I marked up, I sort of, in the margins, I wrote, panel 1, a lot of his patients who saw the prayers that helped them too. Panel 2, show the prayer. Panel 3, beat. Panel 4, put in that line. So you have that moment that in the book it doesn't have. It sort of follows straight sentence after sentence, but by giving it that space to breathe in the comic, you can make it hit possibly even harder. Yeah. So it's just this smack that hits you. So when I was going through the book, I call them wham lines, WHAM, like it hit. So any wham line, I sort of underline and circle, say that has to go in as verbatim as possible. Because for me, that's the heart of the book, and that you want, at the end of the day, you want the reader to feel similar to how they would feel reading the book. And I felt like those lines were important parts of it.
Mm-hmm. I actually wrote it down as hammer line.
That's
yeah. Well, I like. I mean, there's one element to this that is used really well as like a hammer, and maybe it's how it's used in the book, and I just don't remember it. But it's interesting seeing how you and Albert like deploy "So It Goes," and I think that "So It Goes" in a lot of ways is like this when it comes to like the pacing and like timing elements of comics, it's almost like a punctuation point in some ways. Like you talked about that 2-page spread of Dresden after it's destroyed, and you have all it says in the bottom right corner is "So It Goes," and it is interesting because it felt like you were limiting the spoken and narrated words in the script to let the visuals do the talking, and then let the words you choose act as those wham lines or the hammers or whatever you want to call it. Was that kind of what you were trying to do? Yeah,
I mean, that spread, that was, to me, the payoff of all the "So It Goes" throughout the book. And I remember in the script saying, we can take as long as we want on this page, and in the lower right-hand corner, it'll say "So It Goes." Because it does sort of function as this metronome or this punctuation. Or if someone dies, we get "So it goes, so it goes, it goes." And you kind of start to gloss over it in the prose book because you're used to seeing it so often. It shows up a lot in the graphic novel too. But for that spread, I wanted us to sort of stop and just, have that wham line hit us and be like, that's again, it's the same thing where it's incredibly bleak, but also functions as a punchline to sort of sum up the bombing of Dresden with "So It Goes." It's just,
yeah,
it's amazing. I wanted to capture that in the graphic novel version of it. But yeah, giving it the space to breathe.
Mm-hmm.
I think on the page before that we have "So It Goes" twice, and not really important. It's sort of the metronomic way, like this: "So it goes, so it goes, so it goes." And then before this one, we have a couple. It's the only place we use 3 panels of just black, just to like space it out and be like, "This is your eyes are closed, and here's the big spread where they're open again."
Yeah, yep. I'm looking at it right now. Yeah, it's just, I don't know. I mean, it also helps a lot that Albert. I mean, not that Albert has any shortage of highlight moments in this book, but the first 2-page spread of Dresden in its full glory with just Oz kind of in the bottom right corner, and then the 2-page spread with Dresden after it's destroyed. I mean, like those are, I don't know. So I don't know if he draws traditionally or digitally, but someday those pages will probably go to the same person who has a lot of money because they're just astonishing pages by him.
That first 2-page spread where everything before it's bombed, every single character has a story and a face. Like they're not scribbled, they're all drawn, rendered to be individual people. But he's like, I wanted to give all these people identity because these are real people who died in theory. Like they're not based on real people, but they represent real people.
Right.
And so he felt like, and sometimes you can get away with a crowd scene with just suggestions of people, but here I want to individually draw every single person in this scene. And I think you don't notice that consciously, but you notice it unconsciously when you're hit with that spread. It just feels like there's a whole city here. It's filled with people.
Yeah, I mean, even in the details of the buildings and everything like that, it's like every person, every corner, every facade of a building has like a story to it. And the thing is like there's a lot of different ways you can make that 2-page spread work, but at the same time, it's like it feels so lived in. It feels like so when you eventually get to that 2-page spread later on of Dresden destroyed, it's like all of that work that Albert put on that page and it being,
lost.
Yeah, dropped to rubble. I mean, it's like that. I mean, I don't know. It's just, again, it's just such a hammer visually. And because you immediately recall that other 2-page spread and you're just like, this was just that. And now it's this. And it's just, I don't know. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, no, it's incredible. We could talk all day about how great he is and how amazing he made that spread. Because like I say, it's the heart of the book. And if those pages didn't work as well as they do, you wouldn't feel the impact of the bombing as well as you do, which is the core of the story. So they're so essential to what's going on in the book. And that's not me. That is Kurt, and that is to a large extent Albert.
Mm-hmm. It's really fascinating, and I don't know what this says about me and Billy Pilgrim, but like you have so many "So It Goes" throughout this entire story, and like the most impactful, like the thing that hit me the hardest in terms of just pure emotion was, and I mean spoiler for Slaughterhouse-Five, I guess. But
we should have started with that. Yes, Dresden gets bombed in the book. So.
Yeah, but the part at the end, the part when Billy finally breaks down, isn't when he thinks about all the death that he's been around. Isn't when he thinks about like the war that he's been through, or like he's unstuck in time or anything like that. It's seeing these 2 horses that they rode back to Dresden so they could reclaim riches and things like that. And seeing that they're like on the edge of death, and I don't know, it's interesting. I don't know, that part is such a fascinating moment. I hate to draw a parallel between Slaughterhouse-Five and John Wick, but it's just there's something about like the direct specific innocence like in animal life, and it just like hitting after this cathartic moment where he's having the happiest moment of his life. It's such an interesting moment, and I don't have a really good question for that, Ryan. It's just fascinating that that's how we're affected as humans. So It Goes is the way that those types of things hit, but animal life, completely different. I don't know why.
Yeah. I think especially in the graphic novel version of it, because Albert gives these characters such humanity and empathy that the line Billy hadn't cried about anything else in the war. I believe comes straight unchanged from the text. But that panel before of Billy with his hand over his mouth
Yeah.
as tears are coming down his face. I remember in the script I didn't say the hand over the mouth, and when I saw it, it almost made me cry.
Yeah.
He's so upset.
Yeah.
And you're like, yes, I feel that. This is horrible.
Well, I do. Albert's part is interesting because, from what I understand, he didn't come on until you were well into your script. And
I'd actually finished the script.
whoa, okay,
Yes.
okay, that is very well into your script.
They sent him the complete script.
That's.
Do you want to draw them?
I was going to say whether you changed anything at all once you started seeing Albert's pages, but I guess I'm curious. Like, obviously, you didn't change your script then, but did Albert have room to change things to best bring the story to life if need be? Because I mean, his performance is so masterful in this book. I mean, it's beyond compare. And I'm interested whether or not he had like kind of the leeway to change things, or I guess he did because you didn't have covering the mouth in there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I tell every artist I work with, like, you are the visual thinker. If you have a better idea, please do it because it'll make a better book and I'll get the credit for it, which is also good. But yeah, it was hard to write a book not knowing who the artist will be. And I had intended at some point to, once I started skipping pages back from Albert, to change things, to rewrite it for him. But then he was just doing everything so well, and he would make changes that would just elevate it. And he felt fully able to do that, which is great. My favorite example of that is, and this is only showed up, it was like the last surprise of the book, was the sequence where they're in the slaughterhouse working, and Billy's spooning the slurry for pregnant women, the malt syrup, and it gives them nutrients, and then he shares it with Derby. The comic indigenous thing there is that the syrup is orange, and when he takes a spoonful of it, his body turns orange, and the same thing happens with Derby. And I thought, what a wonderful way to show that. That was not in the script. That was Albert, and I asked him about it, and he said, "You know what? It just came to me when I was coloring." And I thought, I'll color in the same way to show that it's having an effect. So this is sort of just, I don't want to say happy accident because there's a lot of intentionality and skill that goes towards that, but it was so showing the way that the book can develop as you're doing it, and just tweaking and changing things as you go.
Yeah. I got to say, the part of the comic that really revealed the magic of comics to me is how you all dealt with censoring Billy Pilgrim's tremendous wang.
Tremendous wang.
I mean, that brought a tear to my eye, like the malt syrup did to Edgar Derby, because it was just beautiful work.
Thank you. I was really happy with that, because I thought we would just have it in a box on top of the genitals, and it was Albert who put it at a suggestive angle. So it's like, chef kiss, perfect. That is the best dick joke in this classic bit of literature we're doing.
It was. I mean, it's interesting because it's like, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, I got to go back and look at the credits, but I mean, Albert he did the line art, he did the colors, and he did the letters, right?
Hey, I'm going to blow your mind here. Not only did Albert do that, he, in the line art, drew the balloons and the boxes.
Wow.
So the unlettered version doesn't have art behind those balloons, which means like you are committed to what's in those balloons. I can't change what there and add lines or anything because they have to fit if they're in those boxes, and those boxes have to be there, which felt a little bit like being on a tightrope, because normally I do like to change things once the art comes in, but
yeah,
his art fit things so well. There were very, very few changes, and I think it was just me fixing, where I put the wrong word in or something.
Right. I mean, imagine if you were like, oh, actually, I'm just going to remove this entire part. And you're like, you have to draw actual art here now?
Yeah, like there's nothing behind there. You have to draw it in.
That's amazing.
I didn't do that.
Good.
No,
Good.
I was super impressed.
Did you know his stuff before this?
No, I'm ashamed to say I didn't. And it's crazy because it feels like this has happened to me multiple times in my life where I'm doing a book with a publisher, with an editor, and they bring on an artist, and you would think that would go really poorly because you are effectively two strangers now doing a book together, which is,
it's an
I don't
arranged
say
marriage.
intimate, but it feels like an arranged marriage. And every one of those arranged marriages have worked. Like Braden and Shelley on Adventure Time, we did the book together. We're great pals. Erica and Derek on Squirrel Girl, same thing.
Mm-hmm.
It feels like I've had the luck of, working with these large corporations and using them as like a friendship dating service or creative partnership dating service. And Albert too, like he's just incredible.
I love that.
And it's such a privilege. Sorry, go on.
No. I was just going to say, I love that. I mean, I really like, the only thing I was familiar with his work from was the Panel Syndicate comic he did, Universe, which is just wonderful. But I mean, has such an incredible career. But I do love that I was reading an interview with the two of you where you admitted that after you were done with this, you guys were such gluttons for punishment for adapting Kurt Vonnegut that you talked about adapting another Kurt Vonnegut book afterwards.
Yeah. We had a good time.
You did. And I mean, honestly, it's like, I think that it's interesting. It's like, I could say this feels like a very, like, I'm writing a comic review and want to say a compliment sort of thing. But I really mean this completely genuinely. Like, I don't think that this book turns out the way it does if it didn't have two people on it who genuinely love this story. And like, you can see that on the pages, and that's rare. I mean, I'm not saying that people don't love the work that they do, but I mean, it's like, we were talking before we started recording. It's just like the, taking on a project like this, that's a lot of pressure, and you want to succeed because, as you said, I mean, what were you saying about how you don't want to be the person
you don't want to be the guy who screws up Vonnegut.
Exactly. Yeah. I do want to say one other thing that I think that you guys did a really great job with was, I mean, obviously there's a lot of it, but I love what you did with the Troll Famadorians theater for viewing human behavior and how Albert brought that to life. It's really interesting though, because as I was reading that, it's one of those ideas that back then would have just seemed insane, but now it sort of feels like a Tuesday on social media. All the Troll Famadorians would need at this point is like Hootsuite and a few social accounts.
Mm-hmm. They're just there to watch.
They're just there to watch. Did you, I mean, because you were already done with your script, did you find, like, what was the experience of, like, seeing Albert's pages come in and, like, I mean, I guess there wasn't a traditional collaboration, but just, like, seeing that story manifest itself page after page, was that, I don't know, was that a real path to like fostering a real relationship between you two? Because it sounds like you guys are, you had your dating service experience and it worked out really well.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't mean to sort of describe it as like I wrote the script and he drew the comic and never the twain shall meet. Like we discussed stuff during it, and he would send me if there was a question about the script or what I intended or whatever. I tried to put as much historical reference in the script where I could, because I knew like this is a period piece,
mm-hmm.
and it takes time. It takes 10 seconds for me to write. We're in a World War II boxcar.
Mm-hmm.
What do those look like? So I would look them up and find photos and include them where I could. And so we had a conversation sort of back and forth about it. But seeing those pages come in, there were parts where I would go back to the book, the prose book, because I'd see a sequence that he drew, and I'm like, that's incredible. Did I write that? Or did Kurt write that? And I think it happened maybe 4 times, if I recall. I think 3 of the times Kurt had written it, and 1 of the times I had written it. And I got to be, the rare sort of thing where you can actually be impressed by your own work without feeling ashamed about that, because I thought it was Kurt who had done whatever sequence I was impressed with.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, that was a bit of me there. Good.
I love that. Well, in a lot of it, I mean, that's the interesting thing is like some of this stuff, it can become kind of nebulous in the end, where it's like, was that Kurt? Was that me? Was that Albert? I don't know, but it's what we resulted in. I mean, like, here's one thing I wanted to bring up that I didn't really have a question attached to it, but I feel like it's one of those moments. It's like, I really like the part where Billy is kind of melting down because the barbershop quartet is singing, and it's not even what they're singing. It's just the sight of them, and he's trying to figure out what's happening. And the way that Albert did it, and this might be in the script, so I don't really even know. The barbershop quartet's speech bubble changes color once Billy realizes it wasn't what they were singing that affected him, because it's like what they're singing is now less important. And I don't know if I'm attributing too much like thought to it, or if that's like something you guys were genuinely doing, but that's another one of those Magic of Comics things where it's like, was that you? Was that Albert? I don't know, but it's pretty awesome.
Yeah, that was not in the script. That's Albert.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
I think I may have said like it's in the background or something, but no, that's Albert making that live at home there.
Yeah,
in the medium.
Well, I just have a few more questions, and I did want to talk about. I mentioned earlier about when I first read it, it was right before the election, but it was such a fascinating year for this book to arrive, and a fascinating time for this book to arrive because, I mean, first off, it was announced in January and released in September this year. And the weird thing is that might as well have been like a different decade based off of how insane the year was. And
yeah,
you know, I mean, I don't know when you started working on it. I'm guessing probably like 2018, if not 2019. Did the insane change, like just basically the year we went through, did it make the experience of, you know, creation and then announcement and then when it actually gets released rather strange and kind of disconnected feeling for you personally?
A little bit. We'd initially hoped to have the book out for Slaughterhouse-Five's 50th anniversary, which would have been 2019. So I had written the script. I think I started it in late 2017.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so I do recall at some point in 2018, 2019, maybe even 2020, although probably before then, looking at Derby's climactic speech and being like, just want to make sure I still believe all this stuff. Okay, good.
Yeah.
It works.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, like looking at the book, you know, especially with like Edgar Derby's speech, or even something like Howard W. Campbell Jr.'s messaging and like how it fits, like the line where he says like, well, I guess it's from his like monogram, I guess it was, where it's a crime for an American to be poor, even though America is a nation of poor. And it's weird looking at all of this messaging through like the prism of, you know, where America is and where the world is. And I don't know. I mean, I feel like in some ways, you know, if it came out in I'm not trying to say I would have liked it less, but I wonder if it came out in 2019 as it was originally planned, if it would have hit me quite as hard without like the surrounding environment. I don't know. That's one of those things that's a very nebulous question. It's not even really a question for you, but.
Well, I think I have an answer for you.
What's that?
To this nebulous question. It's more an observation, I guess, is that I think part of the reason it works as well as it does is that this is coming from a prose novel written 50 years ago. Mm-hmm. And so it's clearly not intended to comment on the present because it can't. Right. The person who wrote it did not see the present. But because it not intended to comment on the present, but still works as commentary on the present, that gives it a sincerity. Like, you know, you're not reading polemic or something intended to shift your political allegiances in the year of our Lord 2020, because it's impossible. It's just an opinion that still carries relevance because it's a correct opinion or a resonant opinion. And I think that gives it this almost a ring of truth you can't get otherwise, because you've sidestepped having to question the author's intentions because you know the author isn't talking to you in the way that you're reading it. Right.
No, that makes sense.
That's my theory anyway.
I like that theory. I mean, honestly, like, I think that, I mean, beyond that, it's just like, I think one of the interesting things about reading it is like, there's such a fascinating blend of emotions reading it, because it's like, at times it's very, I mean, it's a very sad book, and it's also a very like poignant book, but at the same time, there's also times of like great, like, I don't know, unexplainable joy. I don't even know how to describe it, like catharsis. And it's interesting reading it, though, because especially given that 50-year gap, it's like, in a lot of ways, the world has changed dramatically. In a lot of ways, it hasn't. And that makes it timeless. But, yeah.
Oh, it's a great book.
And I do want to, last thing I want to say about the actual production is, I love, like, it was a great book, but the production value on it, Archaea did serious work on it. Great production value on that thing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad. You always have a moment of fear, I think, as a writer when the time between having a manuscript or, you read the PDF, the digital version of the book, and then you have the physical one in your hands. And there's so much that can go wrong in a physical book that I think most people who don't produce books don't see, but you notice. And you're like, oh, I know that the alignment in the gutter there is too close to the margins. This whole thing's ruined. But this turned out really, really nice.
It did.
It feels like a solid book, which is all I want. Like, you don't want to you want it to have the same heft as, at least emotional heft, as a prose book does. And it feels like it can sit beside it on the shelf and not feel like a lesser version of it, which is all I wanted.
I do, I think this was right around the same time, but it's really fascinating too, because it was like, I don't know if you saw it, but I remember, I think it was S.E. Hinton, the person who wrote The Outsiders, and it was like right around when this book came out that she was talking, basically it was just, somebody presented the idea that maybe they should make a graphic novel adaptation of The Outsiders, and she was just basically like, I don't want people to just like look at my book, I want them to read it. And it's interesting because it's like there's always questions. I mean, full disclosure, I bought this book for my nephew as a Christmas present because I think he would absolutely love it, and I think he'd love the adaptation of it. And I remember I mentioned it to my mom, and she was like, "Why did they adapt it into a comic?" And I was just like, "Because everyone responds to different mediums differently." It's like I had a friend who one time told me that he, like, when he reads, he cannot visualize the story in his head, like he's just seeing words. And I think for some people, it's like it's a way to unlock reading for them. And I don't know. I mean, I just think it's interesting because it's like some people might question, like, why do you adapt a classic like this? And it's because it might make it work better for somebody and still be respectful to the original text.
Yeah, 100%. I had someone email me once with a question about was Romeo and/or Juliet, the book I wrote. And they said, I find it really interesting because you don't describe what anyone looks like, except you say that Juliet has a red dress. And I wondered why that was the one detail, because when I'm reading, I don't really imagine what people look like. And it turns out I don't either. Like when I read a story, I can imagine scenes, but I never focus on what the people look like. They're just sort of entities in my mind space. And so when I'm writing, I don't super care about what people look like generally. This is important to the story.
Sure.
And so the reason I had Juliet in a red dress was I knew the book would be printed in black and red. So there was going to be a red dress. That was the only color available to me. But yeah, I agree with you that you're in this medium. It's a different medium. And the thing, what I love about comics is that it is an inherently fun medium, right? Like you hold open a book of prose and a book of comics, and your eye is going to go to the book of comics because it's a more interesting, fun medium. Just the same way that movies are fun, and a bad movie can still be fun just because it's a motion picture and that's entertaining to us. I feel like comics has that intrinsic level of fun and maybe even joy to it, which helps a lot as a writer because you kind of get that for free. And, seeing Kilgore Trout's expressive face or seeing Billy with his hand in his mouth and the tear in his eye, that hits harder for me than it did in prose. It ever could in prose, really. Like, I don't believe I cried at that scene in prose. I thought it was a great scene, and I felt a human emotion. But, like, seeing it as Albert rendered it hit harder. You feel more, at least I do. I feel more for the characters when I can see their faces and they're there on the page and the expressive little people that they are. So it's, for me, it's, I guess I'm saying this as a reader, it helps me connect with the story more, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've talked to librarians about the same thing. I mean, it's, they come across young people who, like, maybe, I don't know, who are more visual people, and like that type of stuff just unlocks for them. And I think that's fantastic. But well, the last thing I want to ask you about, this is, I was like sitting on my couch last night thinking of questions, and I had this like and then my wife and I ate dinner, and I was in the middle of like eating, and I was like, oh God, and I have to write this down. And all I wrote down was nonlinear career. And then later on, I had to actually like reinterpret what I actually meant. But, I do think it's interesting. Like, it's a very nonlinear story. It's one of the foundational elements of it. And it's part of the reason why I think it works so well in comics. But you've also, like, your career is really interesting. Like, you have such a fascinating career because, like, you went to school for, like, computer science. You made coding magic and Project Wonderful as, one of the things that you did for like supporting web comics back when you first started, like Dinosaur Comics and everything. I mean, Dinosaur Comics, that is a very successful web comic / like it's literally in newspapers, like alternative papers like up here in Anchorage, Alaska. I mean, you did Adventure Time, you've written books like the ones you've talked about already. And then, you did something like this, you did Squirrel Girl. It feels like your career, in some ways, it's like you're Billy Pilgrim, and it's like you blink and all of a sudden you're writing books, and you blink and all of a sudden you're coding and all this stuff like that. Does it feel like you have a little Billy Pilgrim in your career, or is it just like nothing nearly as dramatic as that?
I mean, I'll take it. I will say it may not be the smartest thing to do because usually a career you start doing something and then you do more of it, and that leads to more opportunities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. As you can build on something. And I'm hopping around a lot, right? Doing all sorts of different things. Part of it, I think, is I really have this twitchy thing around originality where I want to do something that's new, or that feels new, at least. That's new to me. And so that leads to all sorts of different things. Like, had there been a Choose Your Own Path Shakespeare book, I would not have written a Choose Your Own Path Shakespeare book. The nonfiction book I wrote about how to survive if you're sent back in time existed because I effectively waited 30 years for someone else to write that book. Mm-hmm. And was like, fine, I'll do it myself. But it's sort of, I have the privilege, I've been lucky enough to have the privilege to kind of chase those things that seem interesting to me. Mm-hmm. And then, which lets me be in a position to, do a graphic novel adaptation of Slaughterhouse-Five, and sort of see where that goes. So yeah, I mean, I feel like we've all felt like Billy in times where you're not sure what's happening or where you're going to go next. Mm-hmm. And you're sort of along the journey, but there's good and bad versions of that, to be sure.
Yeah. I'm interested in regards to like the, doing those things that hadn't been done before. Is part of that, how much of that is you wanting to realize something that you would love to see in the world? And how much of that is like the challenge aspect, I wonder what making a Choose Your Own Adventure Shakespeare book would be like, or I wonder how I would, do this, like, is it a little bit of both, or is it mostly on one side?
I think it's a bit of both. I think part of it is also the exploration of it. So Dinosaur Comics is an example. It's the same pictures every day. I change the words. Better than it sounds. My initial idea was I wanted to do a comic and couldn't draw, and I didn't know that comic writer was a job because all I read were indie comics where people both wrote and drew them themselves. So I thought, well, how do I get around that? And my first idea was a comic where the pictures always change, telling the same story. That's the exact wrong project for me to do. What if I flipped it? Same pictures, different words. And the thing I love about comics is that it is a very young medium, and there's still things like literally being discovered that you can do with this medium that haven't been done before. And so doing like remixing the same panel so many times, I thought that had not been done before. I found out 6 months in that The Angriest Dog in the World is a strip that existed that always had the same 3 panels. And if I had known that, I would not have started Dinosaur Comics. I would probably not do any comics, and we would not be having this conversation right now because I wanted to do something that was new. But I thought it was new at the time, and 6 months in, I was too committed to stop. So I went with it. So sorry, David Lynch, for retroactively stealing your idea. But like, that's what's so exciting about comics. One of my favorite cartoonists is Jason Shiga, and when I read a Shiga book, I think with like 100% success rate, he does something in the book with comics that I have not seen done before with comics. Like, he pushes the medium forward in some way. And that's insane. Like, that is an incredibly high bar that he is just routinely meeting of doing something new with a medium. And I think that is what is so appealing about comics to me, is that it is this space, this medium where people are still doing new things. Like, you wouldn't, maybe I'm wrong, but I can't think of a prose novel that I read recently that I said, oh, I haven't seen that done with text before.
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of things done with text. I feel like I'm pretty confident in what a novel can do.
Right.
But I'm not confident in what comics can do. I'm sure there's still more things that it can do that we haven't seen yet. And that's a medium I want to work in, right? Where you don't know where the boundaries are, where the walls are, or you can knock a hole in the wall to find there's a whole new room behind that that you didn't know was there. That's great. And that's what's really exciting to me. And that was sort of what I was trying to do with Slaughterhouse, me and Albert, was do all the stuff that we could find that comics can do that nobody else can do, and sort of show that off and make it feel like this was meant to be a comic all along.
Yeah. Well, I think you all succeeded, which is why I made it my comic of the year. And I loved it. It was such a great comic, Ryan. Congrats to you and Albert on the amazing work. But that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about the book and everything else. I appreciate you taking the time.
No, it's my pleasure. I'm glad I could answer every one of your questions.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with writer Ryan North. You can find him on Twitter at RyanQNorth and his work in Slaughterhouse-Five. Love Off Panel and want to support it? Subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts today and give the show a rating or review while you're at it, but 5 stars only. You can also support the show by backing it on Patreon. Find the show at patreon.com/offpanel, and when you back it on there, you get early access to each week's podcast as well as weekly content and more. Want even more? Subscribe to my subscription comic site Sketched at sketch.com for long-form articles, interviews, and the rest of the site's content and its members-only forum. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by liking it on Facebook at /Sketched. That's SKTCHD. Follow on Twitter and Instagram at @SketchComic or following me at @SliceFriedGold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Megan Marsden, Brandon DePillis, Patrick Brower, Declan Shelby, Dan Garino, Josh Williamson, Adam Freeman, Ben Wild, Brian Klein Q, SB, Antonio Offen, Nick Bennett, Daniel Whitfield, Scotty Young, Susanna Polo, Jeff Weira, Reed Hinkley Barnes, Mario Tiambang, AbductedTheComic.com, Andrew Carita, Matt Mahoney, Charlie Chu, Stefan Hall, Pensacola Pop Comics, Kim Eslin, Philip Myra, Christian Shelton, Kenny Porter, Chris Pacello, Torrin Grunbeck, Fuzz Bubbles, Christopher Todd, Transmitter Down, Waltz Comics and Books, Carl Mizell, Danny Ollie, Paul Slates, Akil Wilson, Alex Dimitriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Liana Kangas, Keegan Ray, Wesley Giff, Sean Kirkham, Alistair Ross, Julio Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Ryanwad, Vita Ayala, Tara Ferguson, Dave Slusher, WMQ Comics, Akil Kokachi, Phil White, Sean Pinello, Ken Heidelman, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, David Kelly, Rob Wilson IV, Nick Polito, Odin McCready, Brandon Fletcher, Gary Maloney, Jonathan Nilsson, Matthew Groom, Jason Massey, Adam Bogart, Matthew Taylor, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, Dave Baraldi, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Ian Maxwell, Cliff Chang, Benjamin Shipper, Colin McMahon, Chris Palmer, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Kat McKenzie, Adam Highfield, Fiona Staples, Chris Halloran, Mark Abnett, Mike Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonakos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art San Francisco. You guys are all the best. Quick thanks to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Off Panel's theme song just for the show. Check out their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.